Mrs. Hattie slowly pushes her shopping cart through the grocery store, her small, fragile frame barely noticeable among the bustling crowd. She moves with purpose, each step deliberate but measured, scanning the shelves for her usual items. There's a sense of routine in her actions. Years of independence have made her self-sufficient, even at her age. A worn purse hangs from her shoulder, its leather soft from decades of use. She carefully picks up a loaf of bread, examining the price tag as if making sure her budget can still accommodate the rising costs. Mrs. Hattie doesn't draw attention to herself, but there's something in her presence that commands quiet respect from those who know her. She's been part of this community for years, long enough for her history as a civil rights activist to be almost folklore. People know her by name, even if they don't always stop to chat. To the outside world, she's just an old lady buying groceries. But to those who've heard the stories of the marches, the sit-ins, and the speeches, she's a living testament to perseverance. She's in the middle of deciding between two types of apples when she hears footsteps approaching from behind. Without turning around, she senses something is off. The atmosphere in the store shifts slightly, voices hush, and movement stills. Two young police officers, fresh-faced and overly self-assured, walk toward her. Officer Daniels and Officer Harris are dressed in crisp uniforms, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Daniels leads the way, his eyes narrowing as they land on Mrs. Hattie. He's holding on to this suspicious person, report they've been called to investigate, though there's no real suspicion, just prejudice dressed up as concern. Harris lags slightly behind, following his partner's lead. Both are new to the force, eager to prove themselves but lacking the experience or wisdom to question the biased call they've responded to. They spot Mrs. Hattie near the produce section, and without asking a single question, they've already made up their minds. She's the one they're here for. Daniel steps closer, and his voice cuts through the stillness of the store, low but authoritative. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stop what you're doing and step away from the cart." Mrs. Hattie, who has done nothing but shop for groceries, looks up from the apples, her brow furrowing slightly. She's been here before. This isn't the first time someone has looked at her and seen a criminal instead of a human being. But it's still unsettling. She straightens her back, letting go of the apple in her hand and turning fully toward the officers. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her voice is calm, steady, but there's a quiet strength beneath her words. Daniels doesn't answer her question. Instead, he gestures toward her purse. "We've had reports of a suspicious person matching your description. You wouldn't be trying to take anything that doesn't belong to you, would you?" There's no subtlety in his tone, just thinly veiled accusation. Mrs. Hattie's face remains impassive, but a flicker of insult crosses her eyes. She's been called many things in her lifetime, but a thief? That stings. "I'm just here to buy some groceries," she replies, her voice firm now. "I'm not sure what you mean by suspicious." Harris steps forward, trying to assert himself. "We've been told someone's been loitering in the store. Hanging around, causing trouble." He eyes her cart, as though expecting to find stolen items hidden beneath the bread and fruit. Mrs. Hattie keeps her composure. She's spent decades navigating moments like these, when authority tries to make you feel small, tries to make you doubt yourself. She's too old for that now. She meets Daniel's eyes, unflinching. "I've been shopping here for years. Ask anyone in this store. I don't cause trouble, and I certainly don't loiter." Daniels doesn't back down. He's already decided she's guilty of something, even if he hasn't figured out what it is yet. He steps closer, his voice dropping as if to intimidate her. "Then you won't mind if we check your bag?" There's a pause, a brief moment where time seems to hang in the air. The shoppers nearby are no longer pretending not to notice. Phones are out now, cameras recording every second of this interaction. But no one says a word. No one steps in. Mrs. Hattie looks down at her bag, then back up at the officers. She knows they don't have any reason to search her. But she also knows that refusing will only make things worse. Slowly, she opens her purse, revealing nothing but a few personal items and her wallet. Daniel's eyes flicker with disappointment. He didn't find what he was looking for. But instead of apologizing or backing down, he doubles down on the aggression. Why are you still here, then? Seems like you've been in this store a long time for just a few groceries. Mrs. Hattie exhales, the weight of their baseless accusations settling heavily on her chest. She knows what this is. This isn't about theft or loitering. This is about control. About showing her that no matter how much respect she's earned, no matter how many years she's lived with dignity, they see her as nothing more than an inconvenience. I'm taking my time, officer, she says, her voice as steady as ever. Is that a crime now? The question hangs in the air, unanswered. Daniels and Harris exchange a glance, realizing that they've underestimated her. She's not going to cower or panic. She's not going to give them the reaction they expect. But instead of backing off, Daniels leans in, his tone dripping with condescension. We're watching you, ma'am. Don't think for a second that you can get away with anything. Mrs. Hattie stands her ground, her eyes locked on his. I've gotten away with living a long, honest life, she replies softly. I don't plan on changing that today. The officers, frustrated by their inability to provoke her, finally take a step back. The tension doesn't leave the air, but they've lost the upper hand. They mutter something to each other before walking away, leaving Mrs. Hattie standing alone in the aisle, her heart pounding in her chest. As they disappear from sight, the crowd of onlookers slowly resumes their shopping, but the damage is done. Mrs. Hattie may have won this small battle, but the humiliation, the disrespect, it lingers. She grips the handle of her cart a little tighter and pushes forward, but the weight of what just happened won't be shaken off so easily. The grocery store incident, caught on camera by several bystanders, spreads like wildfire. No one in the store that day had the courage to step forward, but they recorded the interaction with shaky hands, ensuring that the scene would live far beyond the aisles. The video is raw and unpolished, capturing every bitter word spoken by the officers, their casual dismissal of Mrs. Hattie's quiet dignity. The voices of the officers, sharp, condescending, and filled with entitlement, dominate the recording. There's no focus on Mrs. Hattie's face or her identity. The camera hovers at a distance, but the tension is unmistakable. The disrespect hangs in the air like thick smoke, suffocating everyone who watches. Officer Daniels' voice is the most striking. He taunts Mrs. Hattie, pressing her with unnecessary questions, refusing to accept her calm explanations. His words cut deep. You know how this looks, right? You can't just wander around and expect not to be questioned. The recording captures Mrs. Hattie's attempt to stand her ground, her voice steady but clearly strained. I'm here to buy groceries, officer. I've done nothing wrong. Despite her composed resistance, the video shows how Daniels dismisses her as though her words mean nothing, as if her existence is an inconvenience. Officer Harris, though quieter, backs him up with every look, every gesture. Their authority unchecked, they continue to probe, casting suspicion without merit. The humiliation is palpable. As the officers eventually walk away, the video lingers on Mrs. Hattie for a moment, her hand still gripping the handle of the cart. The camera doesn't zoom in, but you can sense the weight she's carrying, the quiet exhaustion of someone who has been through this too many times. The scene ends without closure, just a bitter taste of injustice. Mrs. Hattie is left standing alone, and the bystanders finally lower their phones, returning to their own business, unaware of the storm their recordings are about to unleash. Later that day, one of those witnesses uploads the video to social media. It's a faceless account, someone whose name never comes to the forefront, but the caption beneath the video tells the whole story, asterisk. Elderly black woman harassed by racist cops for shopping while black. This is the reality we live in. Asterisk. The video itself is under 2 minutes long, but in those 2 minutes, it captures everything: the overt racism, the abuse of authority, and the indifference of a society that stands by and records instead of acting. Within hours, the video begins to gain traction. It starts small, friends of the witness share it, their circles expand it further. Comments flood in, full of disbelief, anger, and sorrow. The rawness of it strikes a chord with people. It's not just another story of police misconduct, it's something more personal. The woman in the video could be anyone's grandmother, anyone's mother. The fact that the recording never zooms in on her face adds a layer of anonymity that makes her symbolic of something much larger, a universal experience of oppression. By the end of the day, the video has thousands of views, then tens of thousands. Hashtags begin to appear, hashtag justice for grandma, hashtag stop police brutality. The clip makes its way onto Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube, shared by activists, influencers, and everyday people alike. Major media outlets catch wind of it soon after. News articles begin circulating, headlining the story of an elderly black woman targeted by police in broad daylight. The video is everywhere, replayed over and over again, each view further embedding the injustice in the minds of the public. What makes the video so powerful is its simplicity. It shows the abuse for what it is, without embellishment, without commentary. The officer's words and actions speak for themselves. They're undeniable. And as people watch, they don't just see a random old woman in a grocery store, they see a system that has been failing for decades, if not centuries. They see the racism that still lingers in the air, the prejudice that wears a badge and calls itself law. Comments flood in from all corners of the internet. People share their own stories of similar encounters with law enforcement, stories of racial profiling, humiliation, and injustice. For many, Mrs. Hattie becomes a figure representing their own pain, their own brushes with an oppressive system. Others are simply horrified by the idea that a woman of her age, a grandmother figure, could be treated with such disrespect. How could this happen? People ask. But the truth is, it's been happening all along. This video is just a reminder. Civil rights organizations quickly rally behind the video. Prominent activists and community leaders share it with their own followers, adding to the growing outrage. A call for justice rings out across social media. The narrative is clear: Mrs. Hattie didn't deserve this, and it's time for something to change. Social media becomes the battleground for public opinion, and as the video circulates, it becomes more than just a clip, it becomes a movement. Online petitions demanding accountability for the officers begin to surface, gathering signatures by the hour. Protesters begin organizing, planning to gather outside the grocery store in solidarity. Local activists call for reform, for the officers involved to be held responsible for their actions. National civil rights organizations, sensing the momentum, begin to push for broader conversations about police reform, using Mrs. Hattie's story as a rallying cry. Throughout all of this, Mrs. Hattie's identity remains unknown. She's not named in the video, and no one from the store has come forward with more information about her. This anonymity makes the story even more powerful. The woman in the video could be anyone, anyone's grandmother, anyone's loved one. Her identity is less important than what she represents: a lifetime of survival in the face of racism and injustice. Speculation begins to swirl online about who Mrs. Hattie is, what her life has been like, and whether she's aware of the impact her story is now having. People wonder about her history, her age, her family. But more than anything, they focus on what the video reveals about the world we live in, a system that still allows black elders to be treated with such casual disrespect. The video, while brief, becomes a symbol of something larger than itself, a reminder that the fight against racism is far from over. In the coming days, Mrs. Hattie's story will come to the forefront, but for now, she remains an icon of a movement growing faster than anyone expected. The outrage builds, as does the demand for change, and the viral video becomes a catalyst for a conversation the world can no longer ignore. As the viral video continues to spread, the identity of the elderly woman finally emerges. Mrs. Hattie is no longer just a faceless victim. The local news begins to dig into her past, piecing together her life story. They interview her neighbors, friends, and anyone who knows her, revealing a rich history that stretches back to the heart of the civil rights movement. Mrs. Hattie, once quiet and living a modest, retired life, suddenly becomes a symbol for something far greater. The news clips and interviews paint a picture of a woman who has faced down injustice before. Mrs. Hattie wasn't always the soft-spoken, elderly figure seen in the grocery store video. In the 1960s, she was a fierce and active participant in the fight for racial equality. There are images, grainy, black and white photos of her at the front of marches, arms linked with other activists, as they face off against hostile police forces. She stood her ground in sit-ins, faced arrests, and was unyielding in the demand for civil rights. Back then, she was full of youthful energy, and her determination burned just as brightly as it does now, though more quietly in her old age. The footage of her today, juxtaposed with these moments from her past, strikes a powerful chord with viewers. The younger generation, seeing these flashbacks of Mrs. Hattie in her prime, realize that the fight she was involved in decades ago is eerily similar to the one they face today. It becomes clear that while progress has been made, the core issues of racial injustice and systemic discrimination are still unresolved. Mrs. Hattie's voice, now in the spotlight, reflects this. She's interviewed by a local news reporter, her voice soft yet firm as she speaks about the experience. "I thought, after all we went through, after all the marches, the arrests, and the sacrifices, things would be different," she says. "But it seems like the struggle just took on a new face. It never really went away." There's a quiet sadness in her words, but also the hint of the same unbreakable spirit that pushed her through the civil rights era. News of her past further galvanizes her community. The elders who know Mrs. Hattie personally are reminded of the fire she once carried, and the younger generation feels the weight of her experience. She becomes a living connection between past and present, a symbol of the continuity of the fight for justice. Neighbors who have known her for decades come forward, offering their support. "Mrs. Hattie's always been a fighter," one of them says on camera. "She stood up back then, and now she's standing up again. We can't let her fight this battle alone." Soon, local activists and community leaders begin organizing in her name. Protests are planned outside the grocery store where the harassment took place. People start to gather, carrying signs with messages like, "We stand with Mrs. Hattie," and "Enough is enough." The viral nature of the video brings out not just the locals, but people from neighboring towns and cities who come to show their support. It's no longer just about Mrs. Hattie, it's about confronting a system that has oppressed people like her for far too long. At first, Mrs. Hattie is hesitant about all the attention. She's lived a quiet life in recent years, keeping to herself, and the last thing she wants is to be thrust into the spotlight at her age. But as the days pass, and as she watches the community rally behind her, something shifts. She realizes that this moment, as uncomfortable as it may be for her personally, is bigger than she is. She sees how much her presence means to the people, how her story has become a focal point for those who have faced similar discrimination. The weight of the moment presses on her, and she understands that stepping forward now isn't just for her, it's for everyone who has been silenced, everyone who has been too afraid to speak out. With this realization, Mrs. Hattie agrees to speak at one of the protests. It's not an easy decision. Her body isn't what it used to be, and her voice has softened with time. But when she stands in front of that crowd, holding a microphone, her words carry a lifetime of experience and pain, and they resonate with the hundreds who have gathered to listen. "I've lived through this before," she begins, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "We fought for change decades ago, and we thought we had won. But the truth is, we never really did. Racism doesn't die because we wish it to. It shifts. It changes form. It finds new ways to show its face. And now, even at my age, I see it as clearly as I did when I was a young woman standing in those marches. But we can't give up. We can't ever give up." The crowd is silent as she speaks, hanging on to her every word. Mrs. Hattie doesn't deliver a fiery speech, but her quiet strength is even more powerful. She calls for justice, not just for herself, but for the generations who came before and those who will come after. Her words reflect the importance of protecting the vulnerable, especially Black elders who have already sacrificed so much. She reminds the crowd that the fight isn't just about one woman being harassed in a grocery store, it's about dismantling the systems that allow such incidents to happen again and again. The rally grows, as does the movement around it. Mrs. Hattie's story spreads beyond her community, reaching national news outlets and even garnering attention from larger civil rights organizations. People from all walks of life come together to support her cause. The protests become not just a demand for accountability from the police department, but a broader call for systemic change. Mrs. Hattie becomes the face of this movement, a symbol of resilience, and a reminder that the struggle for justice is far from over. As the community stands united behind Mrs. Hattie, there's a renewed sense of purpose. Her story, steeped in the history of the civil rights movement, brings people together in a way that transcends the generations. Her voice, her history, and her quiet strength become the driving force behind a push for lasting change, inspiring everyone who stands with her. The viral video triggers a wave of public outrage, forcing the local police department into a corner. With no other option, they announce an internal investigation into the actions of Officers Daniels and Harris. What began as a routine patrol now transforms into a full-blown scandal, with the officers' every move scrutinized by both the media and the public. News outlets are relentless, broadcasting updates about the case, demanding accountability, and running stories about racial profiling in law enforcement. It's no longer just about these two officers. It's about systemic failure and racial bias within the department. Civil rights lawyers, eager to take on the case, step forward to represent Mrs. Hattie. They frame the incident as part of a larger, deeply ingrained issue of racial profiling and police brutality, not just in this town but across the country. The lawyers prepared to file a lawsuit against the officers and the department itself, aiming to bring about more than just individual justice for Mrs. Hattie. They want systemic change. Their goal is not only to seek restitution for the humiliation and trauma she suffered but also to use this case as a stepping stone toward widespread reform. The officers, Daniels and Harris, tried to downplay the situation at first. They claimed they were just following standard protocol, asserting that Mrs. Hattie fit the description of a suspicious person. They expressed no remorse, their tone suggesting they believe they're being unfairly targeted in a politically charged situation. But the public doesn't buy it. The video is damning, and the overwhelming reaction from people across the country makes it clear that this isn't an isolated incident. This is emblematic of a much deeper issue. Under pressure, the police department places both officers on administrative leave while the investigation is underway. It's a temporary move, designed to calm the public, but it doesn't satisfy anyone. Community activists and civil rights groups are relentless in their demands. They want permanent consequences. They want accountability. The court of public opinion has already made its decision, and it's clear that no amount of institutional shielding will protect the officers from facing the fallout. The legal case gains national attention. Civil rights organizations and legal experts rally around Mrs. Hattie's lawyers, calling for widespread police reforms, including mandatory racial bias training, better accountability measures, and an overhaul of how officers are disciplined in cases of misconduct. The legal team representing Mrs. Hattie argues that this case is an opportunity to address not just the harm done to her but also the larger issue of unchecked power within law enforcement. In the courtroom, tensions are high. The trial becomes a media spectacle, with news crews covering every development. Mrs. Hattie, once reluctant to be in the spotlight, now finds herself at the center of a national conversation about race, justice, and dignity. She knows this is bigger than her, and while it's emotionally taxing, she is determined to see it through. When Mrs. Hattie takes the stand, the courtroom falls silent. Her presence commands respect, and her words carry the weight of a lifetime's worth of experience. She speaks not just about the incident at the grocery store, but about her entire life. Growing up in the Jim Crow South, fighting for civil rights in the 1960s, and watching history repeat itself in a modern-day grocery store. "I've been here before," she says, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've seen this hatred, this injustice. I've lived through it. I fought against it. And yet here we are, still fighting. Still trying to prove that our lives, our dignity, matter. This is not just about me. It's about every black person who has been judged, harassed, and dehumanized simply for existing. Enough is enough." Her testimony is powerful. The jury, the judge, even the opposing counsel are visibly moved by her words. It's clear that this case isn't just about legalities, it's about morality, about what kind of society people want to live in. The defense, representing officers Daniels and Harris, attempts to shift the narrative. They argue that the officers were following department procedures and had no personal malice. They claim the situation was escalated because of social media and that the video, while powerful, doesn't tell the whole story. But their defense falls flat. The public, and the jury, have already seen enough. The video speaks louder than any excuses the officers can offer. In addition to Mrs. Hattie's testimony, witnesses who were present at the grocery store are called to the stand. They recount what they saw, how the officers treated Mrs. Hattie with disdain, how she was nothing but respectful despite their harassment, and how the situation escalated for no reason other than the color of her skin. The video is played in the courtroom, over and over, leaving no room for doubt about the officers' actions. The legal team representing Mrs. Hattie pushes for concrete consequences, not just financial compensation, but real change. They argue for the implementation of stricter accountability measures within the police department, including external oversight on cases of racial profiling and misconduct. They also call for mandatory racial bias training for all officers, arguing that this case is proof of the dire need for such reforms. As the case progresses, it becomes clear that this is more than just a trial, it's a referendum on the state of policing in America. The court of law mirrors the court of public opinion, and the officers' defense crumbles under the weight of overwhelming evidence. They are held accountable, not just by the legal system, but by the society that watched their actions unfold in real time. By the end of the trial, it's not just about the two officers anymore. It's about changing the culture within law enforcement, ensuring that what happened to Mrs. Hattie doesn't happen again to anyone else. The legal battle, once about a singular act of harassment, turns into a movement for systemic reform. Mrs. Hattie, through her quiet strength and unyielding dignity, has become the catalyst for real change. In the aftermath, reforms are slowly implemented. The police department, under intense scrutiny, begins to overhaul its policies. There are public promises of greater transparency and accountability. Racial bias training becomes mandatory for all officers, and external oversight committees are established to handle cases of misconduct. The legal victory sets a precedent, and other cities across the country take note, implementing similar reforms. Mrs. Hattie, though reluctant to call herself a hero, has become one in the eyes of her community and the nation. What began as a moment of humiliation has turned into a triumph of justice. She has reignited the fight for equality, and shown that even in the face of adversity, change is always possible. The court's decision is clear. The officers are found guilty of misconduct, and the police department is left with no choice but to enact significant reforms. Public outcry, combined with the evidence presented during the trial, makes it impossible for the department to brush this case aside. New policies are introduced: mandatory racial bias training for all officers, regular evaluations of conduct, and a more transparent process for handling complaints of racial profiling. These changes, while long overdue, represent a critical shift in how the department will operate going forward. The reforms are met with cautious optimism, both by the community and activists who have long fought for systemic change. Mrs. Hattie's victory in the courtroom isn't just about financial compensation, though she is awarded a significant settlement for the emotional and physical distress she endured. The real triumph lies in the broader impact her case has on the community and the nation. Her story has touched the hearts of millions, becoming a rallying point in the ongoing struggle against racism and police brutality. The media portrays her as a symbol of quiet strength and resilience, a reminder that even in the face of blatant injustice, one person's courage can spark a movement. As reporters continue to cover the aftermath, they focus not just on the legal victory, but on the changes Mrs. Hattie has helped inspire. Her story is held up as proof that accountability is possible, even in a system resistant to change. She is interviewed by prominent media outlets, and her face becomes synonymous with the fight for justice. But for Mrs. Hattie, the recognition is secondary. She's more interested in ensuring that future generations don't have to experience what she went through, that the pain of racial profiling and police abuse doesn't persist as a constant cycle. In the weeks following the trial, Mrs. Hattie returns to the grocery store where the incident occurred. This time, the atmosphere is completely different. As she walks through the aisles, heads turn, but not in judgment or suspicion. People recognize her and greet her warmly. Shoppers stop to smile or offer a kind word, acknowledging her strength with subtle gestures of respect. The employees, who once stood by passively during the altercation, now go out of their way to assist her. It's a small but significant transformation, a sign of how one person's courage can change the energy of a place. Despite the trauma she endured, Mrs. Hattie holds her head high. She has not allowed the experience to break her spirit. Instead, it has fortified her resolve to continue the fight for justice. The viral video that once captured her humiliation is now a symbol of her resistance. It has catapulted her into the spotlight, but she uses that platform with grace, knowing that her story is much larger than herself. Every time she speaks out, she does so not just for her own dignity but for every other Black person who has been mistreated, dismissed, or dehumanized by the very institutions meant to protect them. Mrs. Hattie finds herself invited to speak at rallies and forums, standing alongside younger activists who see her as a beacon of inspiration. She tells her story with a steady voice, never seeking pity but always demanding justice. Her speeches aren't filled with anger, but with a quiet insistence that the fight for equality is far from over. Her words resonate, especially with the younger generation, who are drawn to her unshakable belief in progress, even after a lifetime of witnessing both the worst and best of humanity. Though Mrs. Hattie is now a national figure, she remains grounded in her community. She attends local meetings, supports grassroots initiatives, and encourages her neighbors to stay engaged. She reminds them that while her case brought about some reforms, there is still much work to be done. She stresses the importance of vigilance, of holding institutions accountable, and of never becoming complacent. Her community, in turn, rallies around her, seeing her not just as a symbol but as one of their own, a testament to what can happen when ordinary people refuse to back down in the face of injustice. As time passes, Mrs. Hattie's legacy grows. What began as a personal fight for dignity has turned into a larger movement for systemic reform. Civil rights organizations cite her case as a turning point in the fight for police accountability, and new laws are proposed to protect citizens from racial profiling and abuse of power. Mrs. Hattie's story is taught in classrooms, not just as an example of courage but as a reminder that the fight for justice is ongoing, and that progress often comes from the most unexpected places. In the final moments of her journey, Mrs. Hattie reflects on the path that brought her here. She thinks back to her youth, to the protests she attended and the marches she walked, and realizes that while much has changed, so much remains the same. But she is hopeful. She sees the fire in the eyes of the young people who have rallied around her, and she knows that they will continue the fight long after she's gone. Her story will live on, not just as a tale of injustice but as a testament to the power of resilience, community, and unwavering determination. And so, the story closes on a note of hope. Mrs. Hattie's struggle has shown that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one person's voice can make a difference. The battle against racism and inequality is far from over, but Mrs. Hattie's journey has proven that progress is possible, that change can come, and that the future holds the promise of a more just and equitable world.